Welcome to the deep dive. We take your sources, we break them down, and basically help you get smart fast.
Mm.
So today, we're getting into the history of disability and design, specifically in America. This comes from a listener who pointed us to the book Accessible America by Bess Williamson.
Right. And the listener's mission really is to understand this relationship, how our physical world, the buildings, the objects, how that's shaped the lives of people with disabilities, and how their experiences have shaped the environment back.
Yeah, looking for those maybe surprising connections, avoiding just a dry list of facts.
Exactly. Getting the key insights without the overwhelm.
And Williamson's book is great for that because she really digs into how American ideals, things like individualism, rights,
Yeah.
how they've influenced the actual stuff around us.
And not always in the ways you'd think.
No, she looks at what she calls the small things forgotten, everyday objects.
Things we might overlook, like canes, splints, even eye patches.
Right. And how these little things tell a bigger story about disability and how it's understood socially.
Yeah, she starts with a really interesting example, this Mark's adjustable folding chair from like the 1880s.
Okay, what was special about it?
Well, it wasn't just an invalid chair. It was advertised as a whole bunch of things. A parlor chair, smoking chair, reclining chair, lounge, even a bed or a crib.
All in one.
Wow, multitasking furniture.
Seriously. But the key thing is where it was advertised for the parlor.
The parlor, that's the formal room, right? Where you'd entertain guests.
Exactly. So having this chair, which could be used by someone considered an invalid, right there in a refined social space, that tells you something.
It suggests maybe disability wasn't always hidden away. It was part of domestic life, even the kind of fancy parts.
Precisely. It was integrated, which really contrasts with maybe later ideas about disability needing to be kept private or separate.
Okay, so that's the 1880s. How does that compare to, say, later wheelchair designs? Because they look very different. Totally different. Think about those, brightly colored, lightweight wheelchairs that look almost like sports equipment.
Yeah, very functional, active looking.
Right. They reflect completely different cultural values, things like speed, lightness, mobility. It's a shift away from the domestic sphere.
So disability moves kind of outside the home, visually speaking.
Yeah, or at least the design suggests a more public, active life.
Yeah.
Williamson argues that the way wheelchairs changed reflects shifting expectations about, how flexible people should be, how portable their equipment needed to be, what kind of terrain they might cover.
And that even influenced things like the access symbol, the wheelchair symbol we see everywhere.
Absolutely. The visual language changed along with the technology and the expectations.
But, it's interesting. The book talks about how often the physical evidence of disability, the objects themselves, they kind of disappear from the historical record.
Yes, there's this historical erasure. It's like, even though disability is incredibly common, Williamson uses the term TDEVs, temporarily able-bodied, to remind us we're all potentially vulnerable.
Right. That hits home.
It still remains somewhat taboo. You look at old photos, archives, often the wheelchair or the cane is missing, or maybe the person is positioned to hide it.
Why is that? Is it deliberate?
It seems to represent this tension. The reality of needing physical assistance clashes with that strong Western, especially American, ideal of complete independence, being self-reliant.
Like Emerson saying we shouldn't be minors and invalids in a protected corner.
Exactly, that rugged individualism. And then there's the idea of property in one's person,
Mm-hmm.
total self-ownership and control. Disability can seem to challenge that.
So these objects, these aids, they represented something uncomfortable about that ideal.
Mm-hmm. And this becomes even more significant as we move into the modern era with increasing standardization in, well, everything. Architecture products, equipment.
How did standardization change things?
Well, it gave bodily differences a new kind of meaning. Sarah Rose's research suggests that the whole modern category of disability really took shape alongside mass production.
Okay, how so?
In the 19th century, industrial work often caused injuries, right? But people often kept working with those injuries. A missing finger might even be seen as, a sign of experience on the factory floor.
Part of the job, almost.
Kind of. But fast forward to the 20th century, the assembly line. That system increasingly excluded people with disabilities.
Because it demanded a certain standardized pace and movement.
Precisely. And the products coming off that line, they were designed for an assumed normal user, often, as Williamson notes, seen as spry and, frankly, male by default.
With maybe ladies' models as a sort of afterthought.
Exactly. And sometimes this focus on a narrow norm wasn't just accidental.
What do you mean?
There's some really disturbing history here. Christina Cogdell documented how some modernist designers in the 20s and 30s explicitly linked their streamlined designs,
Hmm.
smooth surfaces, clean lines, with eugenics.
Wait, eugenics?
They saw smoothness and efficiency in design as reflecting the elimination of drags on society, on human evolution. And tragically, people with disabilities were included in that category of drags they wanted to eliminate.
That's chilling. Design literally embodying prejudice.
It is. And Karma Guerman's work adds another layer, showing how even things like posture guides and exercise programs back then were framed in engineering terms, defining certain bodies as efficient and desirable and others not.
Wow. So the very idea of good design could have these really dark undercurrents.
Definitely. It shows how deeply biases can get embedded in the physical world. But Williamson also points out something else, that these disability things, the tools and technologies, they often defy what their makers intended.
How so? Defy them.
Well, the intention might be to fix or cure or perfectly accommodate or even eliminate the disability. But the reality of how people use things is often different. Take prosthetic limbs.
Okay. The book mentions the images of veterans after WWII, right?
Hmm.
Looking very capable with their prosthetics.
Exactly. You see these public images, guys, smoking, shaving, driving, all seemingly effortless with their artificial arms. That was the projection, the ideal.
But that wasn't the full story.
Not at all. Post-war studies found that actually only about 12% of arm amputees used their prosthetics at all, and only 6% used them regularly for work or daily life. Many prefer them just for appearance, if they use them.
So a huge gap between the fantasy of the technology and how people actually lived with it.
A massive gap. And it wasn't just prosthetics. Williamson shows how disabled people constantly adapted and used things, both accessible and inaccessible designs, in ways nobody planned.
Like how? Give me an example.
Clarence Day wrote about climbing stairs really slowly, finding a kind of defiance in it. People use cars, wheelbarrows, even freight services to get around inaccessible places. Their ingenuity went way beyond the blueprints.
They were hacking the system.
Essentially, yes. That 1945 photo, she includes the soldiers showing off car controls with prosthetic arms. It looks impressive, but it was mostly staged. And most adaptive driving tech back then was actually for legless veterans, not arm amputees. User accounts tell a much richer, more complex story.
Okay, so users are adapting, improvising, but then there's a shift towards disabled people getting more involved in the design process itself, right?
Yes, that's a really crucial development, moving from being just recipients of design to being active participants and creators.
How did that change things?
Well, think about early accessible design proposals. People like Timothy Nugent, who was a pioneer in developing building access standards.
At the University of Illinois.
Right. His early focus, and that of others, was often on making access kind of discrete, integrating it without extra cost, without loss of space or function, almost invisible.
Like trying not to draw attention to it?
Kind of. But when disabled activists and communities started creating their own access solutions, they were often much more visible, much more assertive. Think about the international symbol of access again.
The blue wheelchair sign.
Yeah. Interestingly, that didn't come from the U.S. initially. It came from a British architect who was a wheelchair user himself. And he specifically argued against a more secret American approach, favoring openly marking access.
Making it visible, claiming the space.
Exactly. And you see that same spirit in more recent movements like #SafeWord, which rejects euphemisms for disability. It's about directness, visibility, claiming identity.
No more hiding. The book also mentions design's optimistic nature. What's that about?
Williamson borrows from Judy Atfield here. Seeing design as inherently forward-looking, a material culture of innovation driven by a vision of change as beneficial.
Okay, design assumes progress, improvement.
Right. But disability often challenges that straightforward idea of improvement. Activism especially often calls for adaptation, making the existing world work, not necessarily inventing something brand new.
That makes sense. It's not always about the next gadget, but about making the sidewalk usable.
Precisely. Which leads to that brilliant ADPT bumper sticker slogan.
Oh yeah, what was it?
To boldly go where everyone else has gone before.
That's great. It flips the Star Trek line on its head.
Totally. It takes that American frontier, exploration ideal, and says, look, our frontier is just basic access to the everyday world that non-disabled people take for granted. It's about inclusion, not some giant leap.
A powerful message. But does that idea of everyone else hold up?
Well, that's where Amy Hamry's critique comes in. Hamry points out that this everyone else isn't some unified group. Inequalities based on race, class, gender, They're already built into our spaces and designs.
So design for all can sometimes gloss over those existing inequalities?
It can, if we're not careful. Hamre notes that a lot of early accessible design actually happened in segregated settings, special schools, separate housing. It wasn't always integrated. And ADPD itself today is very focused on race and class consciousness within disability rights.
Important context. So alongside these big movements, people were still doing their own thing.
Absolutely. Williamson highlights this amazing do-it-yourself culture documented in newsletters from polio survivor groups and disabled veterans organizations. People were literally redesigning their houses, cars, gadgets, whatever they needed.
Grassroots innovation out of necessity.
Totally. And this connects to those university programs. We mentioned Timothy Nugent at the University of Illinois, UIUC.
Yeah, the first accessible campus in the 50s.
Right. You can still see remnants, like a narrow old ramp at the library.
Mm-hmm.
But UIUC's program, groundbreaking as it was, came out of rehabilitation science. The goal was integration into home life, employment.
But still with an emphasis on the individual.
Very much so. It acknowledged environmental barriers, sure, but the main message was that the disabled person had to overcome them. Access was often improvised, and it required training, resourcefulness from the user.
So different from access as a right.
Very different from the later civil rights approach. Think about post-WWII rehab for veterans. There was this mix of patriotic generosity, we need to help our boys, but also intense pressure on the individual veteran to be strong, get back to being productive.
And it was even tougher for civilians.
Generally, yes. Fewer resources, less public support. Even showcase projects like the Functional Home at the Institute of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation in New York.
What was that?
It was like an ideal, accessible home setup. But Dr. Rusk, who ran the institute, his message was still fundamentally about individual effort. Finding access was your project. Technology was a tool for the resourceful user. The brochures showed these calm, accessible rooms, but the rhetoric was all about active engagement, striving.
So the responsibility was still on the person?
Largely, yes. Improved access came piecemeal, often through regulations, rather than a fundamental shift in responsibility early on. Fred Fay, who attended UIUC, remembered Nugent's can-do philosophy, pushing yourself up steep ramps, proving independence. It felt better than being pitied, but it was very different from demanding access as a legal right.
Which is what started happening more in Berkeley, right?
Exactly. The students at Berkeley, many with backgrounds shaped by polio and that overcoming narrative they were starting to question, began connecting their individual struggles to a political, ideological argument for civil rights.
Who are some of the key figures there?
Ed Roberts is probably the best known. He was the first significantly disabled student to live on campus in the Cowell Hospital Infirmary. He'd fought tooth and nail just to graduate high school because they wouldn't give him a diploma without driver's ed, which he couldn't take. He even attended classes via telephone, operated with his foot.
Incredible determination.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then others joined him, like John Hessler, who came from a nursing home. By '69, there was a group of about a dozen disabled students living in Cowell, sharing experiences, building solidarity.
And that led to the Center for Independent Living, CIL.
Yes, founded in 1972. Crucially, it was run by disabled people. For disabled people, the majority of the board had to have disabilities. The focus shifted entirely to independent living in the community with self-directed choices about housing, personal assistance, everything.
And they tackled physical access directly.
Big time. Berkeley undertook a major project to install curb cuts and create accessible routes across more than a mile of city streets. This was way beyond the slow pace of the existing national standards, like ANSI 117.1 or the often ignored Architectural Barriers Act of 1968.
And they involved the community?
Critically, yes. They consulted disabled residents to make sure the routes and cuts were actually usable, practical for daily life. It was user-centered design in action.
Making it work in the real world.
Right. Even finding their own office space was a challenge. They had to improvise fire safety solutions, rooftop ramps, safe refuge areas because the codes were all based on nursing homes, not independent living centers. They were kind of predicting future emergency evacuation guidelines.
And that story about them secretly pouring concrete for curb cuts at night.
Total myth. Eric Dibner researched it. No evidence of any guerrilla curb cutting by the Cowell crew. It makes for a good story, but the reality was more about organized advocacy and city projects.
Okay, so that early accessible design was a response to a real lack. No ramps, no curb cuts, no kneeling buses. How does that compare to design now?
It's different. Early work was about establishing the need for accessible design as a category. Now you see more experimental work, art and design that offers subtle commentary, or treats things like hearing aids as fashion. But Williamson stresses that users have always discussed the quality of design.
It wasn't just about having a prosthetic, but a good one.
Exactly. Disabled veterans rallied against poorly performing limbs. They lobbied for better cars, better houses. Rehab administrators also became design critics. It wasn't passive acceptance.
And people like Nugent translated that experience into standards.
Yeah. His UIUC work fed into those first national accessibility standards. Which brings us closer to the present. Think about the 2016 White House Design for All showcase.
That sounds like a big deal. What was showcased there?
It was organized by Maria Town and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It featured all sorts of things, inclusive clothing, like jeans for wheelchair users, really striking artistic prosthetic designs, elegant 3D printed braces, shirts with magnetic closures, even t-shirts designed with an autistic woman considering sensory needs. Nike showed off an alternative shoelacing system, too.
A real mix of function and aesthetics.
Definitely. And while some of the language still echoed those older rehab themes, prosthetics, letting people achieve dreams, easy closures, creating independence, there was a much stronger emphasis on consumer choice and personal identity.
Less medical, more lifestyle.
Sort of, yeah. The whole event was framed around the experience of the disabled users. Models and designers talked about how the designs related to their identity. Annette Lamont on fashion, Peregrine showing the arm he designed and printed, Sarah Fernandez talking about an empowering dress, Kyle Garcia saying his leg cover changed the conversation from his disability to the design itself.
That's a significant shift, disability as a source of identity and innovation.
Exactly. The showcase positioned disability as driving innovation, as part of civic identity, part of American industry. The Obama administration really highlighted that. It felt different from the ADPT sticker asking just to get in the door. Now, accessible design was being framed as part of the tech future, not just legal compliance.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the main threads we've pulled from this history?
I think we've seen this clear arc from disability often being hidden or erased to becoming much more visible. From design focusing almost purely on function, often medically defined, to embracing aesthetics, identity, user experience.
And critically, that shift from design for disabled people to design with them or by them.
Absolutely. That agency is key.
It really shows that looking at disability and design isn't just about ramps and gadgets. It reveals so much about our changing social values, our ideas about bodies, and who belongs where.
Yeah, it's a mirror to society.
So, a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Thinking about this history, how might design in the future push our boundaries even further? How might it continue to challenge our assumptions about what ability means, about identity, about the spaces we all share? And maybe think about this. What are the small things forgotten in our world today that will tell future historians about how we understand disability and design right now?